What can Big George Foreman teach us about the life of an athlete? So, Big George Foreman is a biopic rather, about the great boxer himself. And this is unquestionably, from my personal perspective, the greatest film that I've ever seen for many different reasons. However, the main reason is the authentic insight that we get into the life of an athlete. For your information, if you haven't seen the film yet, I suggest you don't watch this video until you have. So, first of all, talent is recognised in difficult circumstances. So growing up, George was unfortunately bullied at school due to himself due to his appearance, having a lack of confidence, which made him a very easy target for the likes of bullies themselves. And unfortunately, he used to lash out on those who picked on him due to obviously not being able to handle it, which is again completely understandable. And then this escalated into him unfortunately becoming heavily involved in antisocial behaviour. Also, he was then picked up eventually by a boxing coach who invited him to come into the gym and spotted that George has high anger management issues and also a high involvement in street fights. And then he was invited to come down to this coach's boxing gym and train as well. And then soon enough, his potential was discovered behind the ability to become a boxer. And then after a few sparring sessions, hitting the pads and speaking to other people in the gym, George spoke to his mum about the prospect of himself becoming a boxer to get her views on it. Initially, she was against the idea due to obviously how dangerous boxing is deemed to be. However, it was an intervention to keep George away from the streets and for it to be something to engage him in a sport. And ultimately, this has been the case for many other boxers as well. For example, Anthony Joshua. He was essentially involved in drug deals when he was growing up, alongside spending time in prison before he found his big break into the boxing scene. So ultimately, boxing has provided an opportunity for George to gain into something positive. Lesson 2. There's only one way that things can go when you're on cloud 9, and unfortunately, this is downwards. After George accumulated approximately over 30 wins with an undefeated record, he was on a sky-high vibe in terms of his joy and happiness. For example, he was getting invited to high-profile events, he was getting a team to manage his PR duties, people to manage his finances, and so much more. And it's fair to say the legend of the boxer, due to this, was experiencing cloud 9 symptoms throughout this process. And although things started to take a turn when he began spending less time with his family due to the fight camps and commercial entities, he started to have an increase in interest from new audiences alongside his network skyrocketing, which simply just started to restrict his time available to spend with his family and those that initially stayed with him. And looking at the big picture, I've noticed a pattern with most athletes that begin to grow in popularity. They often start to value fame and money over their legacy in terms of what mark they're trying to leave in the sport. And in spite of this not seen to be the noble thing to do, it's natural, simply because balancing both out is hugely problematic, and a lot of the time, a lot of the very successful athletes in this world come from very deprived backgrounds with socio-economic issues, and they haven't experienced anything like this before. So George experienced this to a high degree, which had a detrimental impact on his performances, where he started to unfortunately pick up losses, fight camps weren't necessarily going to plan, and also started experiencing some health problems himself. Lesson number 3, that is, be careful of who you can trust. So, as Big George began experiencing the luxuries of life, he then began starting to employ others to take care of his finances and other entities. And by doing so, he was numb to the fact of who he could authentically trust. And this began to make him exploitable from various different angles. For example, he invested his trust into one of his close associates at the time to invest his funds into stocks, and essentially George got taken advantage of from this perspective. The stocks that he was getting invested in were essentially seen to be very high risk, which essentially meant that George was losing more money than he was initially investing in, and this was down to his associate taking advantage of the situation that George found himself in, experiencing the high levels. And then unfortunately, as horrible as this is, this can be quite an often occurrence in the athlete space in terms of the lack of respect and transparency provided to you by others. So for example, legend of a boxer, Canelo Alvarez, has openly expressed the lack of respect and authenticity from his previous promoter, Golden Boy Promotions, and the same applies with the likes of former UFC fighter Francis Ngannou, who's clearly expressed his lack of respect towards the UFC due to the amount of respect that they have disowned on him, from his words. And essentially, the learning lessons for athletes to avoid getting into situations like this the best way they can would be to keep a close circle and remember those who are with you during the challenging times as well as the positives. So those are the takeaways that I took from Big George Foreman. So first of all, talent is recognised in difficult circumstances. Be aware of Cloud9 symptoms. And last but by certainly no means least, be careful about who you can trust. Now, that's my perspective of the film. If you've seen it, feel free to let me know in the comments and share some of the lessons that you may have learned from this, because I'm very keen to hear. I'll catch you later.